Let's leave Fo Tudong behind and talk about Dao'an, who was one of his leading disciples. Dao'an is, the point that I want to stress the Dao'an is that he is the one who starts to build the Sangha, the community of monks and nuns in China, and figures out how to do it in a way that is enduring. Fo Tudong has certainly succeeded in making Buddhism the religion of the foreign conquerors. There is, by 349, when he dies, there's new turmoil, war in the north. Many of the disciples flee. Dao'an spends the next 16 years in the north before he too is forced to flee, and he moves south to Xiangyang. He creates the earliest known community of Chinese believers. And their practical needs to build a community. You have to get a temple. And Dao'an shows this by getting the private donation of a mansion and building it out, renovating it with more donations so that 400 monks can live there. He builds a pagoda, basically a hall in which to worship the Buddha. He collects 10,000 pounds of bronze in order to build a great statue, a 16-foot statue of the Buddha that can be venerated. Buddhist monasteries like this would, in fact, during the medieval period, become the centers of economic life in the countryside. They would have flour mills, they would have markets. They were, in fact, on their way, and this very much thanks to Dao'an, to becoming that which held the agrarian world together. Dao'an turns to defining the rules for monastic life, but he doesn't know much about how to do it. So he seeks out books that will tell him how, in India, for example, monasteries were organized, how monks would spend the day, how they would burn incense, how they would recite sutra, how they would eat their meals and what they would eat. He decides that all the monks and nuns will adopt a new naming procedure. Henceforth, they will adopt the Chinese equivalent of the name Shakya as their surname. They will give up their old family names and adopt the name of Shakya, Chinese Shi, for Shirjamuni, Shakyamuni. They all become members of a new family, a family in which the Buddha is the patriarch. But it's also reminiscent of a clan and of a tribe, right, where everyone is joined together. We know that at the time, for example, there were generals who insisted that all their soldiers take on the surname of the general. Well, in some sense, we're seeing the same thing being replicated, this same habit being replicated in the Buddhist Sangha. There's a Chinese gentleman who comes by and sees his monastery and has great praise for him. And I'll just read what he wrote. They do not practice the magical arts. They do not try to frighten people. They are a community of teachers and students who show mutual reverence and respect. Dao'an is learned in Buddhist texts, but also in yin-yang, also in arithmetic, and even in Confucian learning. Dao'an has to establish as well an intellectual identity for these Buddhists. It's still very open. Remember that Fo Tudong did magic, he worshipped, but we don't see a great deal about him creating a scholarly or intellectual identity. Dao'an goes in that direction. He learns about Mahayana Buddhism, that salvation can be shared by people, that not everyone has to follow ascetic practices. And he begins to understand that Buddhism is different from Chinese ideas. Now, hitherto they had a practice of what's called matching concepts. That is, you would take a new term coming from Central Asia, coming from Sanskrit, and you would try to find the Chinese equivalent. So, for example, the all-important word emptiness gets translated into Chinese as wu, nothingness, based on Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. But the difference was that in the Tao Te Ching, wu begets yo, or emptiness, nothingness, is the source from which phenomena arise. That's not the case in Buddhism. It's not something that generates the phenomenal world. It's the absolute. The phenomenal world is a world of illusion. Emptiness is the ultimate and true reality. Now, it's more complicated than that. Eventually, there's a notion that the worldly and the absolute are in some way the same. But it's enough to understand that for Dao'an, recognizing that Buddhist ideas were new and had to be understood in their own terms, that was an important breakthrough for him. And then he has to deal with the following problem. If I know that these are new terms, if I know that these are not ideas that I already had, how do I know if I'm interpreting them correctly? How do I break out of the hermeneutic circle in which I project onto the text I'm reading ideas that I've learned from some other source? How do I make sure I understand what the text really means? Now, we could talk about all sorts of scholarly ways of pursuing that, and it's clear that Dao'an is collecting texts, he's interested in commentaries and so on. But his solution, in fact, was to create a cult to worship Maitreya, the future Buddha. Maitreya resides in Tushta heaven until he will be reborn as a human and become a Buddha. Maitreya's special quality, though, and this is why Dao'an builds a cult around the worship of Maitreya, is Maitreya can guide people to correct understanding. So Dao'an is saying, if we all worship Maitreya, we will take a vow that we should be reborn in Tushta heaven so that we can gain a correct understanding of the Buddhist Dharma. They are seeking the worship of Maitreya, thus, is a way of trying to make sure there's a correct understanding. But note now a very important difference with Taoism. Taoism had texts too, but they were revelations. Buddhist texts are coming from outside. They're coming from the West. And they're not presented as revelations, they're represented as teachings from a person who had gained great enlightenment.